It was June 5th, 1944, in the middle of the Second World War. A man pulled out a sheet of paper and wrote this by hand. The landings have failed. The troops have been withdrawn. The Air Force, the Navy, the soldiers. They did everything that courage and devotion could do. And then the last line. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. Now here is the strange part. At the moment he wrote that, the operation had not started yet. Why would a man write a declaration of defeat for something that had not happened? And what he was waiting for, in that moment, was not more troops. It was not more weapons. It was a weather report. The man was Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces. What he was preparing was the blow meant to end the Second World War. The largest amphibious invasion in human history, the Normandy landings. Codename, Overlord. 150,000 troops, 12,000 aircraft, 7,000 ships. But this operation could not happen on just any day. The conditions required were almost impossible. Let us go through them one at a time. First, the moon had to rise late. Paratroopers needed darkness to drop into. Second, it had to be low tide at dawn. The Germans had driven steel obstacles into the beaches, and those obstacles had to be visible above the waterline so the landing craft could steer around them. Third, the wind had to be calm. The landing craft had to hold formation. Fourth, the cloud ceiling had to be high. Otherwise, the bombers could not fly. So how many days in June of 1944 satisfied all four of those conditions? 3. June 5th, 6th, and 7th. Miss those 3 days, and the next opportunity was at least 2 weeks away. And what does 2 weeks mean here? It means 150,000 men sitting sealed inside ships for another 14 days. And every day, the odds of the Germans finding out climb higher. So Eisenhower locked in June 5th. But in early June, an Atlantic storm system began rolling toward southern England. Now stop for a second. If you were Eisenhower, what would you do? Push forward or wait 2 weeks? Either way, 150,000 lives are riding on it. And to make that call, he had to trust one man. This is where today's main character comes in. James Stagg, a Scottish meteorologist, a group captain in the Royal Air Force. He was Eisenhower's chief meteorological advisor. In plain terms, his job was to stand in front of the Supreme Commander and say, "Here is what tomorrow's weather will be." But that job was far worse than it sounds, because the forecasting team he led was completely split. On one side, the American team. They favored searching historical weather records for matching patterns and predicting forward from those. Statistical, confident. On the other side, the British team. They analyzed pressure systems and the movement of fronts directly. Far more cautious, far more pessimistic. Same data. Two opposite conclusions. And Stagg was caught in the middle. Now why was this so difficult in the first place? This was 1944. No satellites, no computers. The only inputs were observations radioed in by ships and aircraft, plus pressure charts drawn by hand. From that, they had to predict what the sea would be doing 2 days later. With the technology of the time, forecasting 48 hours ahead was close to gambling. And 150,000 lives were riding on that gamble, and this infighting on the team. It looks like just an American versus British turf war, right? But this is what ends up deciding the war. Let us walk through the final 3 days before the decision. June 3rd through June 5th. Day 1. The evening of June 3rd. Stagg walks into headquarters and reports. June 5th is not possible. A storm is coming. The sea will be too rough for the landing craft, and the cloud cover will ground the bombers. After agonizing over it, Eisenhower orders a 24-hour delay. But some of the fleet had already sailed. Ships in open water had to be recalled. Day 2. 9:30 in the evening, June 4th. The library of a country house called Southwick House. Generals and admirals are gathered in the room, and Stagg walks in again. And this time, he says something different. A window is opening. 36 hours. On June 6th, the sky briefly clears. Not perfect, he says, but good enough to go. The room went cold, because outside that window, the storm was still raging. Rain was hammering the glass. They were being asked to look at that and believe a forecast that said it would clear in 2 days. Naturally, some of them were skeptical, but Stagg did not back down from his analysis. Day 3. Before dawn on June 5th. Stagg checks the forecast one more time. The conclusion holds. Eisenhower sat with his commanders for several minutes without saying anything. Then he spoke. "Okay, we go." And right after that order went out, Eisenhower took out a sheet of paper. Yes, that paper. The one from the very beginning of this video. The one where he wrote that the landings had failed and that any blame was his alone. If it succeeded, that note was worthless. If it failed, it meant he would carry the blame by himself. He gave the order and then immediately wrote his own declaration of defeat. That paper was found later in his jacket pocket. Now let us switch sides. At that same moment, what was happening with the Germans? The Germans were not fools. They already knew the Allies were preparing a major invasion. They were even running the same calculations. They knew that in June, only the 5th, 6th, and 7th lined up correctly for tide and moon. In fact, back in May, the entire force went on alert every time the conditions matched. So on June 5th and 6th, what did the German defensive line actually look like? The coastal units had been told to stand down. Half the division commanders and a quarter of the regimental commanders had traveled to a city called Rennes, that is 100 miles from Normandy. A war game was scheduled there for 10 in the morning on June 6th. And do you know what the subject of that war game was? Defending against an Allied landing. They emptied out the actual landing zone in order to attend a training exercise about defending the landing zone. And then there was Rommel, the desert fox of North Africa, the man in overall charge of defending the Normandy coast. He left France for Germany on the morning of June 5th. The next day was his wife's 50th birthday. He wanted to hand her a pair of shoes he had bought in Paris himself. He also planned to meet Hitler on the way, to request more armored divisions. So on the morning the Allies stormed the beaches, the top German commander on that coast was at home, watching his wife try on new shoes. How did it come to this? It came down to a forecast from the chief meteorologist of the German Air Force. He predicted that rough seas and high winds would continue into the middle of June. And German High Command drew a simple conclusion from that report. No invasion is possible in weather like this. So by now, you have probably reached a conclusion. German weather forecasting was terrible. But here is the real twist. That German meteorologist was named Heinz Lettau. After the war, he became a distinguished professor of meteorology at the University of Wisconsin in the United States. And he read the movement of those weather fronts exactly the same way the Allied forecasters did. So the forecast itself was not wrong. The problem was somewhere else entirely. The German military had a rule. If wind speed exceeded a certain grade, An amphibious landing was considered impossible. That standard came out of their own experience abandoning an invasion of Britain back in 1940. Lettau predicted winds above that threshold on June 5th, 6th, and 7th. And he was right. The wind really did blow that hard on those days. So the German logic ran like this. The wind exceeds the threshold. Therefore, there will be no landing. But there was one thing the Germans never realized. The Allies had decided that wind at that strength was acceptable. Both sides looked at the same sky. Both sides read the same numbers. One side concluded it was impossible. The other concluded it was possible. What was wrong was not the forecast. It was the threshold. And there was one more thing Lettau did not have. He had nobody to argue with. Stagg's team fought each other every single day. The American team and the British team collided over opposite conclusions. That fighting looked like a waste of time, but it was actually a safety mechanism. Someone to walk in every day and tell you your judgment is wrong. Lettau had none of that. A correct forecast made alone against an imperfect forecast forged by people arguing. The one that changed history was the second one. So was Stagg's call correct in the end? On June 6th, the Allies landed successfully. The weather was still bad, the waves ran higher than expected, and some landing craft were pushed off their target beaches. But the operation held, and the Germans were caught completely off guard. The real proof, though, came 2 weeks later. From June 19th to June 22nd, the worst storm in decades tore through the English Channel. If they had missed June 6th and landed 2 weeks later, on the next day the conditions lined up. 150,000 men would have sailed straight into that storm. Eisenhower later sent Stagg a short note. Stagg, thanks. And thank the gods of war we went when we did. The battle for the largest invasion in history was decided not by guns, but by a single weather report. Is today's story fact or fiction? Stagg became a hero. Lettau was forgotten. But both men looked at the same sky and read the same data. One of them had colleagues who fought him on it every day. The other did not. So what actually decided it? Skill, or having someone there to tell you that you were wrong? Fact or fiction?